So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the inaugural meeting, the inaugural discussion group of Phil's Book Club. I'm Phil, you may know that. And this is being run by IMD. We launched a new digital content platform called I by IMD. And one thing that we wanted to do was have a book club, and I was asked to direct it. So very glad to have you join us. We're a small number right now. There'll be, I think, others coming, joining later on, but let's begin. My name is Phil Rosenzweig. Some of you may know me. I've been teaching at IMD for many years, and I've also written some books, and that's probably one reason why they thought that I'd be a good person to direct this. We're doing something different today than we will do in future months, because we will have monthly meetings. But this month, because we're just starting out, we're having not one webinar, but we have two. We weren't sure the right time or what would work best for most people. So we're having this one, which is 11 o'clock Central European time, and we'll have another one later on at 6 o'clock Central European time. I'm not sure that we're going to do two every month. We might go from 2 to 1. But the other thing that's going to happen is today we just have the webinar. In the future, what we're going to have is online chats that will be open for a few days. So as we build a community, we will have more opportunity for people to really discuss with one another. Today, you're going to hear a lot from me, and of course, you can use the chat function if you want to speak at various times or ask questions, and there's times I'll ask you some questions. But otherwise, I think it's pretty much me talking, whereas in the future, it won't be that way. Let me tell you what we're going to do today. We'll spend maybe 45 minutes, something like that. If we have very few participants, we can be quite interactive on the chat function. There's also a Q&A function, but I think it's best that we only use the chat function. So if there are things you want to write, put them on the chat function, I will see them. We're going to do about three things today. The first thing is I'd like to introduce the club and tell you what we're in store for and what we have planned. And there are times also to solicit your thoughts on that. So we'll have a first piece that's about the book club. A second piece then, I'd like us to discuss the first book that I selected, which is Robert Iger's book called The Ride of a Lifetime. Now, maybe you read it, maybe you haven't read it, maybe you don't want to read it, but we'll talk about it anyway. And that's, I think, the beauty of a club like this. You don't have to have read the book to be interested in the discussion about the book. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end to talk about where we go from here, because I also wanted to introduce the book that we will have for the month of May. So that's what I have planned for today. So what I'd like to do is introduce the club as I'm hoping to direct it, and to tell you a little bit of what we have in mind. And then I have a few ideas about this book. And then I want to hear a bit from you about what future books may be as well. So with your permission, I'm going to go ahead on that. I do see what you write on chat, although I'm not sure we're going to do a whole lot of that right now. So let me just move ahead and tell you what we're trying to do with this book club. What we're trying to do with this book club is, this is not to be business books per se. You're not going to get books from me about, marketing or finance or strategy or things like that. What I would like to do is have books that speak to the context of management, nor are we going to have things like, great works of literature. When I asked colleagues, what would you recommend? I got everything from Dostoevsky to James Joyce. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is have a series of books that address what I call the context of business. Yes, you're working in business, you're in finance or marketing or whatever it may be, but what is that next level of thinking, of awareness that's very important? So we'll have books that are more in the areas of economics or technology or about psychology, decision-making, interpersonal influence, geopolitics, labor, employment, things like that. That's what we'll be looking for. And I picked the first three books very deliberately to try to convey the scope and the tone. So I wanted the first book to be something very memorable, very personal. And so I picked one that was a personal account by somebody who's a very strong protagonist, Robert Iger, in a company that we all know, in an industry that we can all relate to. And that's what I had in mind for this first one. But going forward, we're going to then stretch out. So next month, the book that I've picked is called Invisible Women, a very successful book a couple of years ago, exposing data bias in a world designed for men. It's about data, it's about product design, work design, it's about society, and it's very much then bringing in the whole gender perspective. And third month, this would be now for June, this book by Parag Khanna called The Future is Asian. So now we're talking about economics, demographics, geopolitics. And if you look at the three of those, I think they provide a sampling of what we'll be doing. I've got other ideas, but I want to hear from you. So that's what we'll be doing, one book per month. Now, if you want to go to Blinkist, great. If you want to go to Get Abstract, great. But my sense is that for many of us, we're on a 24-hour news cycle. We read little snippets all the time, whether it's webinars or podcasts or tweets. There's benefit to going in greater depth. And so the idea of one book a month where we go into greater depth, I think makes a lot of sense. Now, how are we going to read these books? Well, first thing is I'd like to read them with respect. If you've ever written a book, you know that a lot of effort goes into it. Any book that somebody takes the time and effort to write, I want us to take it seriously, but I want us to read them with great curiosity too. What can we learn from this book? What did you think about it? What value can we derive from it? But there's one more thing as well. And if you know me from IMD, maybe things I've written or courses, you'll know that I'd like us to read these books with a critical mindset. I hope you liked the Iger book. I liked the Iger book. But that doesn't mean that I liked everything about it. I had questions. There were things that I thought maybe could have been drawn out a little bit differently. So we're going to read books with a critical mindset. And what do we mean by a critical mindset? Well, in the English language, the word critical can mean a few very different things. If you say to somebody, gosh, you're being too critical, that's one way we use the word critical. It means to be negative or to be disapproving. That's not the way we're going to use the word critical here. Critical also means not to be negative, but simply to try to evaluate the pros and cons, the strengths, the weaknesses. It's to assess the merits and the faults. So you could say, for example, she won critical acclaim for her books. That's not negative at all, quite the contrary. Acclaim, very positive. That's the meaning we're going to have here. To think critically being to assess merits and faults, strengths and weaknesses, what we can learn, and the limits of what we can learn as well. So if we bring it to Robert Iger, and I'll say a bit more on this in a moment, well, what worked for him with his company, in his industry, in his part of the world, are these principles that apply everywhere? Are they limited? He was very successful through acquisitions. He made a string of breathtaking acquisitions. What do we take from that? Do we take that the road to success is by acquiring others? Not so sure. So what are the applications? What are the limits on applications? We'll be talking about that as well. Now, somebody of my generation from the US, you might remember, maybe you're familiar, there was a program on television called At the Movies. And here are these two film critics, Gene Siskel, Roger Ebert from Chicago. What they would do is they would review 4 new movies every week, and they would either give it a thumbs up or the thumbs down. And they would have these wonderful arguments in the studio. We're not going to do that here. We're not going to do 4 books in 1 week. We're going to do 1 book in 4 weeks or 1 book in a month. And so I'm only going to pick books that I think are worth reading. I'm not going to have any thumbs downs. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but anything that I'm going to ask you to spend the time and effort reading, I'm going to think is worth your while. However, and that's what I think, however, it doesn't mean the book is perfect. We're always going to be exercising our critical judgment. And that's where I think the benefit of this kind of discussion group is going to work. Now, the structure is going to be something like this. Okay, the structure of what we're going to do is that there will be one book per month, and I'm going to announce them always 3 months in advance. So the first three were already on our website. The next one I'm going to announce within a couple days, and then it'll roll forward like that. When I announce the book, I'm also going to give you 3 study questions. Why? Because I'm a teacher, and I know, not just for that. There is that. But I want you to be actively thinking about certain things as you read. And then what we will do in the 3rd week of every month is we will have an online forum where in parallel, we can discuss these 3 questions. And you will be able to see what somebody's answer was, and you'll be able to respond to them, and they'll respond to you, and so forth. And I like the idea of 3 different threads because some questions may interest you more than others, but that way we organize our comments a little bit. It's not just a free-for-all where people say whatever they think, but we try to structure it in a little way. So tentatively, beginning next month, if the technology is developed on time, we will have 3 different parallel discussion forums for invisible women addressing these 3 different questions. And somewhere in that week, probably the Thursday, maybe the Wednesday, we will do another live webinar like this. But the benefit then is we'll do the webinar already having opened the discussion forum for a couple days. So I'll be able to look at the discussion forums and say, well, there was an interesting controversy about this, or people seem to think this, or there was a divergence of opinion about that. Let's talk about it, or here's another view. So what we're going to try to do is combine asynchronous discussions online with a synchronous live webinar each month. And I may also have a guest with me. For example, for next month, I don't want to be a man talking about invisible women and biases. I'd like to have somebody who is on the receiving end of that. And so I've asked a colleague of mine, female, to participate in that as well. So that's the idea, okay? Any comments on that? I think if anybody wants to make, you can use your chat is probably the best. Does that sound okay? All right, well, so that's what we have in mind. So let me move ahead. So Sarah, sounds good. Tom, I'm going to read the full book. Up to you, okay? Because that actually leads to my next, which is how can you prepare? Well, you can prepare by reading the book, preparing, participating actively in each month. That's fine. But some of you may say, some of these books really capture my interest, others not. So I'm going to pick my spots. Some months, yeah, others I'll just observe. And the answer to that is great. If some months you just want to tune in and watch the conversation and see what I and others say, that's good too. Or you might say, I'm not going to get these books in advance. I'm going to follow the discussion and then I'll decide if I want it or not. And that's okay too. So whatever you want on this works. Any of the above is fine. You're all busy people. There's lots of demands on your time. This is not something where I'm going to be following up who did this, who did that. I want it to be as inclusive and as welcoming as possible. But that's the idea for the club. Now, I've got 35 after the hour, so I'd like to move on to a little bit about this book. We've already talked about it a bit, and you've all read it and already shared some ideas. We're a small group, so we can have a bit more of a conversation. And then I want to come to the end to talk a little bit about future books. But let's move to this book. So I put a few things together for Robert Iger's Ride of a Lifetime. I not only liked this book because it had gotten very good reviews, but Bill Gates had put it on his list of very, very good business books. And I admire Bill Gates. He's very well read, and he doesn't suffer fools gladly. He doesn't say nice things just to be nice. So he, when he says this is a very good book, I'm inclined to believe it. That said, confession, I'm not a big fan of Disney. I've never taken my kids to a Disney park. I didn't spend a lot of time at Disney parks when I was growing up. I'm not a big fan of the Disneyfication of great stories like, Hunchback of Notre Dame and so forth, but I still wanted to read it. So I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts here, and then we can converse a little bit on this. Um, one thing you find out when you get books or when you look online is they have not only different covers, but different titles. So the book I caught it was the one in the middle called The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons in Creative Leadership. This is about creativity. The US version says lessons learned from 15 years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. The word creativity or creative doesn't belong there. It's nowhere. And I thought, that's interesting. So let me give you a few of my thoughts about this book. First of all, whenever I take a look at a book, I ask myself, what kind of book is this? Is it a research book? Is it making claims? This is a book that is a personal account or a memoir, but very significantly, it's by a serving CEO. He is still the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. Why is that important? I think it's important because it's not a tell-all book where he's going to tell you everything that happened. He's not going to settle scores with these people who didn't treat me well or I didn't like. He's very diplomatic and very positive. But you know what? That could be his nature, or it could be the fact that he is still the serving CEO. He is subject to many constraints. He's got to worry about what shareholders think, what employees think, and he's probably bound by certain confidentiality agreements. In fact, I always read a book and think, why am I being told this and what am I not being told? There is something in this book, I don't know if you noticed this, but when they acquire Pixar, he's very concerned that John Lasseter, the creative genius behind a lot of Pixar, stays. But at the very end, Lasseter is gone for some behavioral transgressions that are not elaborated in any depth. And I wanted to know more, and I thought, why am I not hearing more? And I think the answer is, you can't say more. So this is a certain kind of book. I found it, so a little bit of the chronology. This is a guy who's been now for 47 years with the same company, but the company changes. He joins ABC, a television network acquired by Cap Cities, acquired by Disney. Very important, I think, a word that he never mentions, I don't think he mentions, but I think is characteristic of Iger. He is very patient. He plays the long game. There were various moments where he could have said, I'm being passed over. I'm being sidelined. Somebody's being put on top of me. I'm out of here. He didn't do it. So he's somebody who I think had a lot of patience, played the long game, and was very much rewarded for it. And he's been the CEO since 2005. I also found it to be it's just a lot of fun because it's a company we know, it's an industry we know, and it's irresistible to read about people who are so prominent, the Steve Jobs, the George Lucas. But again, if you're an American of my generation, Roone Arledge, who really pioneered sports television. So I thought that was great. It's also a lot of fun because a series of big, ambitious deals, the process of CEO selection. I've never been through a process of CEO selection, the interviews, the search firms, the board intrigue. So I think it's irresistible at a lot of levels. But I did find this notion of creative leadership to be a little bit questionable. Again, the cover of my book talked about creative leadership. There were examples of creative leadership, but they did not come from Robert Iger. Arledge has talked about the way he used narrative storytelling for sports, or David Lynch with Twin Peaks, or Michael Eisner when he walks Iger through one of the theme parks and talks about the experience of the customer, or John Lasseter at Pixar. Iger's contribution seems mainly to be to understand that people who are very creative need to be protected and buffered and insulated. And I think he did that very, very well. All right. But let me give you a few more thoughts about Iger's book, and then I'm going to get to the end and then loop back to the beginning. A few of my comments. The early years, he talks a lot early about personal lessons, integrity, being decent to people, being respectful to people, taking responsibility for errors. It all sounds nice, but you feel it's fairly genuine. And I think, again, here, he didn't use the word patience, but I sensed somebody who was playing the long game and learned a lot from capable managers. One thing he does not talk about, but this is maybe IMD speak, he does a very good job, in my view, in understanding the difference between a problem and a dilemma. A problem is something that lends itself to a clear solution. An engineer can solve a problem. An algorithm can solve a problem. But a dilemma, by definition, is something that does not lend itself to a specific, stable solution. And that's a lot of what we face in management are dilemmas. So early on, he talks about the dilemma of how do you set high expectations and be demanding as an executive, but still build confidence for the people who work on your team. If your expectations are too high and people are never good enough, you destroy confidence. If you're always encouraging people, maybe you've let your expectations slide. And he's very good at understanding this is not something that lends itself to a perfect solution. It's an ongoing dilemma. Caring about details, being very focused on the small things, but not to the extent that you seem petty or obsessed with things that are not that important. So I thought he did a very good job at that. The second half of the book is really where he comes into his own, and he talks here about leading. And chapter 8 here is the one where we talked about Roy Disney and about Jobs. But what you have then is a series of acquisitions. Essentially, the second half of the book is structured as a series of acquisitions. The Pixar acquisition in chapter 9, the Marvel acquisition, the Star Wars George Lucas acquisition, the 20th Century Fox, and even Disney Plus. This is not a content acquisition. This is the question of, do we develop our own distribution platform or do we buy another one? And they decide to buy. To me, this raises some questions. So I said earlier, I'm impressed by, my favorite anecdote was the dealing with Disney, and Tom Curtin mentioned the dealing with Jobs. But I think we need to be a little bit careful when the second half of the book is about growth through acquisitions. There are some things that I really liked here. The need to think boldly, the importance of picking up the phone and the personal relations. It makes for good reading. It's a nice story. But more than that, I think what he's saying is that these are not just balance sheet deals. It's not just assets. The interaction with a George Lucas, the interaction with a Steve Jobs, the Rupert Murdoch, these are really important. The need to preserve culture and protect creativity. And as one of you mentioned, he's not himself creative, this is Christian's point, but he understands creativity and he understands the need to protect and preserve. What there isn't is there's very little on how he could afford to do this and the capital structure. Very, very little. The danger of that, in my view, is you read a book like this and say, okay, gosh, who should I acquire? I guess the road to success is through acquisitions. Well, be very careful there, because I think, as we know, there's a lot of acquisitions that don't work very well. In fact, there's a lot of evidence from finance and economics that when an acquisition takes place, it's the value of the acquired firm that goes up. The acquiring firm often takes a hit. So is it a good model for growth? Not so sure. When does it make sense? When does it not make sense? I would have liked to have seen a lot more there, because in my view, we can learn some of the wrong lessons when we see somebody go from acquisition to acquisition to acquisition and always be successful. I was looking for one that either didn't work out or didn't happen. And there was one example. I don't know if you came across this. They actually thought of buying Twitter. And the more they looked at it, they said, maybe not. I said, I'm glad you gave me that example, because there must have been ones they looked at and said no, or too expensive. Again, this is a book written by an incumbent CEO. So he's not going to tell you all the things he didn't do, but I think we need to know that. All right, let me move on. One thing I liked very much about this book, it says here, lessons learned. This is somebody who is very concerned about drawing lessons from his experience and then digesting them and giving them to readers in ways that make sense. And he did that early in the book. And the entire last chapter is just a synthesis of these lessons. I think it's one of the strong points of the book. But using my critical thinking lens, I looked at that list and I said, well, it's several pages, all these different lessons. Can we group them? And I would say I would group them under two broad headings. There's the personal and the strategic. The personal behavior, there are a lot of these things that come through over and over about the importance of respect and the importance of integrity and just being decent with people and being fair, taking responsibility, not compromising on values. This comes through early. It's the people he respects. It's what he tries to do. It's probably why he gets the job. It's what allows him to be successful in many ways. And I think there's a lot of very good ideas there. There's also some things about strategy. And here, what he emphasizes is the need to make big bets. He talks about innovating or die. And there I would ask things a little bit differently. I would say, well, that worked well for Iger at Disney and before that, Cap Cities ABC and so forth. Is that always the case? Or is there something about this industry and the importance of technology, changing tastes, that makes it more important to be so willing to take bold bets? You don't want to draw the wrong lessons from this. So I also, as much as I like many of these points about, decency, fairness, integrity, whenever I see lists like this, I always ask myself, is he suggesting that these things drive success? Or are they things that we infer about managers whose companies are successful? And I've written a lot about this in the past, because show me any company that is successful, and I can probably tell you how decent and wonderful and humble and thoughtful their executive is. And show me a company that's not successful, I can probably tell the opposite story. Now, I'm not saying that Iger isn't those things. I'm just wondering, do we tend to infer causality between that and the outcome, or do we infer it from the outcome? Similarly, with regard to strategic action, as I said a moment ago, is the approach that was taken at Disney correct for all companies in all industries, or is it particular to a certain kind of industry? I'm a little bit skeptical when I see a second half of the book that's all about the successful acquisition after successful acquisition. But again, this is where I try to bring in a bit of what I call critical thinking. Okay, there's a couple things I would have really liked to have seen more in this book. There were glimmers of really important managerial issues that he touched on. There was one, from my standpoint, very exciting passage. In my edition, it was towards the end, where he looked up and said, my gosh, we've built this big interconnected organization, but I don't think we have any more the right way to evaluate and compensate managers. We used to evaluate them on the performance of their division on its own, but that doesn't really work anymore. Now we need to think about the group. And so how do we think about evaluation, stock options, all that business? And he went to the board and said, can we do it in a different way? I would have loved to have seen more on that. And I would have loved to have seen more, even a little bit later, on organization design. He has this moment where he goes to a big whiteboard and he says, well, we're doing all this stuff over here, that's the content, and we're doing all this stuff over here, and that's the technology and distribution. We got this stuff in the middle, and how does it all fit? And in a few minutes of imagining on a whiteboard, he says, that's what a modern media company looks like. That's a very interesting process of understanding what we do and how it fits together. I would have loved a bit more there, but I don't mean to quibble too much. My bottom line on this, again, you will take what you want from it. I found it very readable, very enjoyable, very brisk. I thought there were very interesting and useful principles of personal behavior, responsibility, decency, and so forth. I did not find the strategic lessons as satisfying because it was so much a story of acquisitions as opposed to organic growth, and why it means, why it can or cannot be translated elsewhere, I didn't see as much of. Now, let me pause there. To those of you who came partway through, one of the points I made early on, and I'll make it again at 6 o'clock this evening, Central European time, is for this first month, we only have this webinar. But in subsequent months, what we're going to have is online discussion forum, so it'll be much more of a back and forth. I'm seeing some people here are writing comments, and I really can't engage them as I would like to at this time. But there will be a bit more of this. There'll be more structure for this in the future. Okay, so let me tell you where I'd like us to go, looking ahead. This is a slide I showed earlier, but I'm recapping it. So we will do one book per month. If you are able to acquire the book or take it out of a library or buy it or what you will and read, fine. If you just want to tune in when we discuss, fine. But I'm also giving 3 study questions. And then in the 3rd week of each month, there'll be an online forum. And there, I'll say, well, this was the study question, what do you think? And I'd like to see there over the course of 3 days, quite a bit of give and take interaction. At the end of those 3 days, maybe the Wednesday or the Thursday, we will have a forum like this, and we'll see how many people want to log on and chat. That'll be the live webinar, okay? For next month, the book that we will have is called Invisible Women: Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. Here's my copy of it, and you can see I've been going through it, and it's come very well recommended. Here are the questions I would like you to consider. Of course, consider anything more than that, but I'd like to organize a discussion on these 3. One is simply about your reaction, striking, surprising, memorable examples. What did you find here that you thought, wow, I didn't know that, or my gosh, you know, that really surprised me, or how important. So I want one stream where we talk about those reactions. But then the second stream, I'd like to go beyond what the author says, to think from your personal or professional experience. What other examples can you think of? And how important, what's the severity of that effect? What's the source of it? But then I'd like us to have another stream that talks about applications. What can you do? What does your company do in terms of anything you do, from product design, service delivery, workplace management? How can you take action based on these things? So what I am going to encourage you to do is get a hold of the book. Unlike the Iger book, which is still in hardback, this one's in paperback. You can find it quite easily, or you can go on Blinkist or Get Abstract. But I think there is benefit to immersing yourself in the book, and one a month to immerse yourself in. My promise to you is that I'll pick books that are worth your investing a bit of time. And if you do that for these months, I think the result will be quite good. So that's what we will look at. We will notify you about the discussion forum. It'll be, I think, the 18th to the 20th of May, and we'll have the webinar where we will have a live discussion. Today, we're doing it twice. I didn't know what the attendance would be for the morning or the afternoon. It's possible we continue to do it twice. It's also possible we'll go to one, so we'll try to think what the best is, all right? This is for June. If you want to read ahead, I've posted these on iBuyIMD. And then very soon, I would like us to go to, I'll mention what the fourth book is, and that'll be for June. And so I want to move here. These are some books I'm thinking about. I've actually replicated the titles to the rights. And Glenda, in a moment, I'd like to go to the fourth of the polls, please. So here are books that I'm thinking of. One that I'd like to do, I want to take Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of General Electric. It's a very nice counterpoint to Iger. Iger is a successful CEO who is still the CEO. Immelt, arguably less successful former CEO. It's going to be a very different read. But I'd like to pair that with a book called Lights Out, Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric. And if you're willing, maybe in the summer where you've got a little time on a beach, maybe in July or August, we'll read the two of them together. Also, Mariana Mazzucato, brilliant book, in my view, one of the most important books I've read recently, called The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. There's a new book out by Daniel Kahneman, writing now with Olivier Sibony, who's a McKinsey consultant, and Cass Sunstein, who worked with in the Obama administration, and with Richard Thaler, called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. It's coming out next month. I'd like to do that at some point. The two in the upper right are about AI. I just show you two different covers. It's the same book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And the one on the lower right, again, two different covers, but it's the same book, Work by James Suzman. He's a South African anthropologist, A Deep History from the Stone Age to the Age of Robots. I read a brilliant review of this in the New Yorker, and I'd like one of those as well. We're almost at the end of our hour. I'm going to be punctual and stop. But actually, I don't think we even have time for a poll, Glenda. Let's just leave it there.
As you want, Phil.
Okay, thank you. We're just managing time a little bit differently. But you can write to me, please, at this email, bookclub@imd.org. I'm interested in your thoughts of what the next book we should do. Well, not the next in May, but the next one to add in July. And I'm also interested in your thoughts for the club. This is your club, and I would like to orchestrate this in a way that's beneficial for all of us. I'd like to thank all of you who took part today, and I welcome your comments. I'd like to invite all of you who missed part of this hour, if you could join us at 6 this evening, please do that, 6 o'clock Central Time. But you can also then watch that. There will be a way that we post that. So I think we're at the end of time. I want to thank you all for taking part. We'll improve this, but thanks for being with us. I look forward to welcoming you next time, whether it's this afternoon or next month when we talk about Invisible Women. Thank you very much. See you then.